They say some land doesn't change owners. It just changes who it remembers. The morning Walter Davis heard the whisper under his newly bought field. The sky was the color of a washed-out photograph, and the frost stitched thin white seams across last year's ruined corn. He had a paper from the county courthouse folded in his coat, proof he'd won the parcel at an auction with a hand that shook. But paper didn't mean much to ground that had learned people by their footsteps. He was a newcomer here and not a young one, a man carrying failure the way some men carry firewood, stacked high and balanced with stubborn care. He expected the silence of debt and winter. He did not expect the field to speak. It began as a metallic murmur, not wind through stalks, not the vole that had been working the fence row, not the loose belt on the auger. Walter bent, palm to rhyme. Something shivered through the frozen crust, a thin vibration that felt like code more than sound. He had learned to count storms by lightning as a boy, and to tell the difference between honest weather and angry weather. This wasn't weather. It was a message. Wait, the ground seemed to say. Or maybe his own bones were saying it for the ground. He pulled his hand back and laughed once the way a man laughs to push off dread. I've been waiting, he told the field, for rain, for mercy, for a decent year. His voice died into the wide, white quiet. He went to fetch a spade from the pickup, the same battered truck he'd driven to the courthouse to lift a cardboard paddle and bid on a farm no one wanted. Cheap land is rarely cheap. It comes with old troubles and new fences and neighbors who remember different seasons than you do. But Walter had bought it anyway because he needed somewhere to stand that wasn't haunted by all the ways he'd come up short. He didn't know he had bought an argument with history. The spade bit through frost with a reluctant ring. Under the crust, clay gave way to something tighter, less honest than soil. Metal. He cleared a neat square, and the blade sang against a plate buried flush to the earth. Letters bled through dirt as he brushed. Civil Defense. Region 7. Subsector 3. The field thrummed again. A slow heartbeat he felt in the handle, in his gloves, in the part of him that had learned to listen more than talk. Walter lifted his head. The road along the hedgerow lay empty. The elms on the ridge watched like old men at a feed store. He hooked a crowbar under the plate's lip and levered. Cold air exhaled from below, an iodine paper citrus breath that didn't belong in a cornfield. The plate rose on a hinge that had remembered oil. A shaft opened, a vertical throat with a welded ladder and a strip of light along the wall that should not have had power and yet glowed like a practical prayer. He stood there a long beat, the way a man stands at the threshold of a church when he can't decide if he belongs. Then he did the thing he knew, assembled tools and sense into a plan. Headlamp, rope, the thermos that kept coffee warm enough to believe in. He left a note on his counter, a habit that survived the leaving of the person who once read them. Lower field. Back by supper. Supper, as if the kitchen had been warm lately. At the mouth of the shaft, he set a boot to the first rung and descended into the earth's memory, feeling the oddest thing for a man with auction dust still clinging to his coat. Not trespass, but recognition, as if the land weren't asking who he was, as if it already knew. Walter Davis had learned to carry an ordinary day like a weight. He woke before light because work doesn't care if you slept, and he moved through chores with the economy of a man who couldn't afford extra motion. The farmhouse he'd won with a bid and a bruise to pride wore its history in peeled paint and a porch that leaned into its own tiredness. The barn roof scalloped where torn shingles had surrendered to storm. 2 tractors slept in the yard, one dead, one dying. A drawer in the kitchen held a fan of stamped envelopes lined up like sober little tombstones. He didn't talk about hope. He didn't mock it either. He just let it stand outside with the stray dogs and the wind. The auction had not been a plan so much as a corner he turned because there wasn't another left to try. He had told himself a story, new ground, new luck. The cashier's office smelled like pencil shavings and winter coats. The woman behind the glass slid him a deed and said, "Congratulations," with a voice trained to pronounce congratulations, condolences, and notices of default the same exact way. Walter folded the paper and put it where he kept serious things. It felt lighter than a future and heavier than a promise. Now there was a hole in the lower field and a ladder that led into a concrete room washed in the color of old hospital corridors. There was a ventilator with a crank, tins of water, waxed boxes of crackers, a medical kit with a red cross that had faded like a memory but not died. And there was a feeling in Walter's chest that he'd walked into an argument older than he was, one that didn't particularly care what the county record said about the land above. Before we follow him down, before the past calls a name that isn't on the deed, do me a favor. If stories like this catch you by the sleeve, quiet lives buckling under ordinary winters that crack open to reveal a door no one saw, if you've ever looked at empty sky and felt it weight itself with a secret, you're exactly where you're supposed to be. Subscribe so you don't miss the rest of Walter's trouble, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. A porch in Kansas? A night shift break room where soda machines hum? A cramped apartment where your neighbor's radio leaks through the wall like someone else's weather? Pin yourself on our map of listeners while Walter maps what's under his field. Back to the room. The sound that lured him here wasn't the ventilator or the low hum of a dormant transformer. It was a patient click in a steel cabinet, a dial moving in careful half steps as if aligning to an idea. Beneath the cabinet squatted a trunk with rubber feet. Its lid rose a fraction with each click, then settled, as if breathing without lungs. It was warm to the touch. No power lines ran to it that Walter could see, yet the strip of light along the wall gave off an even glow, steady as a held note. There was also a ledger in the medical kit, tucked beneath gauze, and a folded triangular flag. Names, dates, ration counts, terse notes written by hands that knew how to make letters behave. On one page, damp had smudged the ink until it bled. On another, a clear entry stood, Region 7, Subsector 3, Custodian family name, Davis. Walter stared at his own surname as if the room had said it out loud. Auction or not, this bunker believed it knew its people, and it was waiting for one of them to answer. The latter's rungs bit cold through his gloves as he descended the last few feet into the chamber. Walter stood with his back to the wall and let his eyes make a sober inventory. The civil defense triangle was stenciled high near the ceiling, clean as a warning, a geometry of care and fear. The hand-cranked ventilator waited like an obligate habit. The air carried that cellar tang of paper and iron and something citrus, decades old, yet sharp. He found the clicking source, a steel cabinet the size of a small refrigerator, face set with a dial and a needle that jittered, then settled. The needle's rest position didn't match any number, paint worn smooth by fingers long gone. Beneath it, the trunk breathed its fractional breath. The latch was warm. "Who do you belong to?" Walter asked, and heard how odd the question sounded to an object in a room. The room answered by doing what rooms sometimes do for the right listener. It offered him the next door. On the far wall, low and narrow, a hatch with a knurled knob rattled like a throat clearing. He opened the trunk first. The lid rose with an articulated pride, hinges oiled by a ghost. Cold air spilled, clean and metallic, and within lay a device that felt like a radio built by someone who considered radios sacred. It had dials and sockets and a central cradle, empty now, ringed by coiled wires and a metal lip stamped with a label. Message Core, property of Region 7. The cradle's emptiness radiated purpose, like a missing tooth you couldn't stop touching with your tongue. "Core's gone," he murmured. The dial in the cabinet clicked twice, as if confirming. He turned to the ledger. The pages rasped like dry leaves. The hand that wrote those lines favored straight backs on its letters and a practical austerity. Names marched in columns: Barnes, Hughes, Tate, Thompson, and then Davis. The initials were blurred on some, but next to the surname on an older page, legible despite time, a full line stood out. Thaddeus A. Davis, volunteer warden, 1962. Not his father, not his grandfather, a man he didn't know he came from. The ledger's spine creaked. Walter felt the oddest sensation, the opposite of the auction room's fluorescent emptiness. This wasn't a document closing on him. It was a door opening. The hatch rattled again, impatient this time. He crawled through and into a narrow passage, light pooling ahead in a low circle like a spill. At the end, another hatch yielded to his shoulder. The second chamber was larger, circular, with 4 shallow alcoves and a central pedestal shaped to cradle something spherical yet not, a softened polyhedron where edges had learned to be kind. The cradle glowed, faint and steady. The room hummed with a frequency you might miss if you lived your life above ground, the sort of hum you don't register until it stops, and the world feels wrong for not holding it. Walter stepped to the pedestal. The glow brightened as if greeting him. He put both hands flat to the empty cradle and felt a mild current like a living animal's warmth. "What do you want?" he asked, and again felt foolish, and again the bunker pretended he wasn't. A crackle lifted from somewhere, the ceiling, the walls, the metal itself, then organized into a voice. Archival, clipped, trained by drills and a century's faith in procedure. Subsector 3. Lineage Registry confirms assigned custodian family name, Davis. If a bearer of that name is present, provisional access is authorized. If message core is removed, execute Protocol Theta. Retrieve or seal by custodian line. Walter's mouth went dry. Auction or not, deed or not, the bunker had not been built to care about titles. It cared about names. He tried a sentence at the air. This is Walter Davis. I only just bought the land at a county auction. I'm no custodian. I plant corn and try not to lie about how that goes. The voice did not reply with comfort. It replied with instruction. Locate the core. Restore to cradle. If restoration is not possible, seal and notify. Notify who? He asked, but the crackle died. In the silence that followed, something else arrived. A low thud somewhere above, like weight on concrete. Not his boots. New boots. The ladder shaft was no longer private. Walter clicked off his headlamp and let the pedestal's lambent glow chart the room in pale geometry. Alcoves. Hatch. The seam of the ceiling square. He flattened himself in shadow. The ceiling panel slid back and a rope unfurled. Neat. Sure. A figure descended. Not farm, not county, but purposeful. A silhouette in a close-cut jacket with a patch on the sleeve that echoed the civil defense triangle without fully matching it. A mask covered the face. The bag on their shoulder weighted the rope like truth. Boots touched concrete. The flashlight found him. They didn't start. They assessed. You must be Davis, the figure said, voice even, as if the distance from rope to floor had been practice for this moment. You're in my field, Walter said, and felt the ridiculousness of the sentence. His field of 27 days, a stranger to his tractor and his habits, before he let the steel of it settle. However new he was the one standing here with a name the bunker recognized. The figure didn't flinch. Not trespassing in the usual sense, they said. This is a continuity site. The property changes hands. The obligation doesn't. What's in the bag? Walter asked. What always belonged here? Walter nodded toward the pedestal. Then it's time something came home. The mask came off with a practical tug. The face beneath was younger than the voice had sounded. 30s, maybe. Eyes that did math first, feeling after. Mara, she said, if we're going to argue, we shouldn't do it through cloth. He almost smiled. Walter. She set the canvas bag on the pedestal edge and unrolled it with care. Inside, swaddled in cloth soft from use, lay the missing piece. A core the size of a small melon, its skin a honeycomb of matte facets that drank the light. Walter reached with a mechanic's caution. The core was warm, not with heat but with attention. It recognized the cradle and the hands that carried it there, or perhaps it recognized only the pattern of a moment that had been designed decades ago and had finally found its hour. Why bring it back now? Walter asked, still whispering though the room didn't ask for quiet. Because someone else noticed the plate opened, Mara said. Scavengers with scanners. They sell memory to men who think owning what other people endured makes them safe. We got here first, but we won't be alone long. She tilted her chin at the ledger on Walter's belt. You saw the name. Thaddeus A. Davis, he said. 1962. Volunteer warden. Your great-uncle by most reckonings, Mara replied. The county rosters list him as custodian for this subsector. He didn't leave a deed, Walter. He left a lineage. That's why the registry authorizes anyone bearing the family name, not the owner, the heir to a promise. Walter looked at his hands around the core and felt, for the first time since the auctioneer's gavel knocked wood, like a man standing somewhere he could justify. Let's finish what he started, he said. They set the core into the cradle. The fit was inevitable. The pedestal's glow steadied into a warm, earnest light, practical as a kitchen bulb on a hard winter morning. The ventilator in the first chamber twitched a slow spin. The cabinet dial found its number and rested. Then a new voice filled the room. Older tape, older breath, the sound line softened by years and by the hum of the machine that had been asked to outlive its maker. If you're hearing this, my name is Thaddeus A. Davis, volunteer warden for Region 7, Subsector 3, year 1962. The consonants wore the iron of a man who sharpened his own tools. I wasn't the owner of whatever farm stands over you now, and I knew I wouldn't be. Land changes hands, names wander. But custodianship doesn't belong to deeds. It belongs to a promise. When they shuttered our post, they told us to leave the core and trust the chain. I didn't. I sealed it and logged our surname, Davis, so the duty could find any of us wherever the map pushes us. Walter shut his eyes, not out of piety but to keep the room from tilting. The simple part is this, Thaddeus went on. Don't mistake the plan for the people. We were trained to love the map until we forgot the town, to love the shelter until we forgot the door. If the world goes dim, open up. Spend what you've stored. Light, grain, skill, time, stubborn love. It multiplies when you let it go. If you bear our name, you have my leave to finish what we started. Call the names in the ledger, not to hide, but to gather. A soft chime, a breath. If you aren't kin, forgive the presumption. If you are, forgive the delay. We kept this for you because the world forgets. The earth remembers. The message settled. The Corps' hum became a presence rather than a plea. Above, in the shaft, dust trembled down. More boots on concrete. Mara's eyes sharpened. We won't have the room to ourselves much longer. Walter touched the ledger's cover. Then let the room do what it was built to do. The second rope dropped with an unceremonious slap against concrete. The square of ceiling yawned, the shaft above a gray throat. 3 shadows took turns becoming men, lowering themselves with a competence that had nothing to do with farming. Their boots broadcast a certain confidence, the kind purchased on other people's thresholds. No insignia on jackets, only the posture of mandate without invitation. Mara moved a half step to the side of the pedestal, angling herself between the Corps and the new arrivals. Walter did not retreat, but he let an alcove give him darkness. He had learned to let rooms help him. Evening, he said, polite as weather. Afternoon, the lead man corrected, a reflex trained by conference rooms and clocks set to other places. He swept his flashlight once and let it rest on the Corps, then on the ledger under Walter's arm. We're here to secure a historical asset. County's aware. County knows about a lot of things, Walter said. Some of them it learned from the people who live on them. He tipped his head at the Corps. This one belongs where it's sitting. That's not for you to decide. The lead stepped closer, measuring not distance but the shape of permission in the room. Continuity artifacts are best managed by professionals. Continuity, Mara repeated lightly. Good word. You want continuity? Start with the instructions written by the people who built this place. She nodded at the pedestal. The custodian line has authority, not the deed. Davis is present. Protocol Theta is executed. The Corps is restored. The second man, taller, impatient, lifted a hand as if to brush past talk. The Corps responded with a mild rise in tone. A string pulled an inch tighter. No drama, just physics that had learned manners. He stopped. The third man took in the ventilator, the strip light, the quiet competence of a system old and still certain. Some rooms talk. This one said, you can embarrass yourself here, or you can make a wise exit. The lead tried a softer door. Sir, Mr. Davis, there are regulations. There's also a recipe, Walter said. It's older than your paperwork. It says, when a thing that keeps people alive wakes up, you don't haul it to auction. You set a table, not your call. It is tonight, Mara said, almost kindly. There's a custody burst to the last active receiver. It's already gone. Trespass here turns a quiet inheritance into a public mess. You'll be internet famous for breaking up a community potluck. The line landed oddly in the concrete air. The lead swallowed annoyance. His flashlight found the ledger again, then Walter's face. He was looking for a split he could pry open. Fear, shame, the kind of gash bureaucracy fits neatly into. He didn't find one. We'll return, he said finally, as if the idea were a punishment. We'll have coffee, Walter replied. And names. They left the rope. That was arrogance or strategy. Either way, it would be useful later. Their boots climbed the ladder. Their breath moved away, and the square of ceiling drew shut with a concierge's finality. Walter didn't exhale until he heard the chirp of a truck remote far above, faint as rumor. Mara rolled her shoulders, letting mission pride relax back into bone. You handled that, she said. I didn't handle anything. He tapped the pedestal lightly. The room did. They still had work. The Corps' pedestal included a small glass-guarded toggle labeled Burst, Seal. Mara pointed. We send once to say the line is alive. Then we seal for local playback. That's the design. An archive that teaches neighbors to be neighbors again. Not a trophy for a museum that likes its glass thicker than its conscience. Walter lifted the guard and set the toggle to burst. The room sang. Not loud, but complete. A note that reached into the part of a house where prayer lives even if no one says any. Somewhere between the roof and the sky, a humble receiver in an old woman's kitchen warmed to life. A desk radio in a volunteer fire station crackled past the ballgame. In a teacher's trailer at the county line, a light on a console that hadn't lit since she was a kid winked once and held. "Seal," Mara said. He clicked the switch down. The pedestal's glow continued. A hearth instead of a signal flare. "What now?" Walter asked. "Now you go above ground," she said, "and spend what was stored." He climbed the shaft with the ledger against his chest like a steadying hand. Mara followed, pausing twice to listen the way a field listens before storm. They eased the plate down, snow-white frost edging its seam into discretion. The field lay quiet, feigning innocence. 2 black trucks idled far out on the road, the kind of distance that felt like a promise of return. Walter looked over the lowered plate toward the farmhouse that leaned, toward the barn roof that learned resignation, toward a kitchen where the light he'd left last night had burned itself to a tiny bronze blister on the bulb's filament. He had bought this place because it was available. He stood here now because it had called his name. He made his first call from the porch. The number on the ledger rang a long time. When a voice answered, papery, alert, perfectly of this county, he said, "Ma'am, my name is Walter Davis. I've got a ledger with your husband's name in a hand older than mine. We're setting a table tonight." A pause, then the scrape of a chair on linoleum, a sound that had been rehearsed in kitchens for 50 years. "I'll bring bread," she said. Not a question. He made the next call, and the next. Some numbers were dead ends paved by time. Some answered with confusion. A few answered with finally, a word relieved to be employed for something other than funerals. Mara stood at the edge of the porch, scanning the road, the hedgerow, the thin lines of snow that began to ghost down like ash that meant comfort rather than ruin. "They'll come back," she said of the men in the trucks. "Scavengers always do, but it's harder to steal a table than a trophy." Walter nodded. He didn't feel brave. He felt put to use. There's a difference, and the difference saves lives. By dark, boots sounded on the porch in sets of 2 and 3. Hats hung on pegs that hadn't seen other people's hats in years. The ledger lay open on the kitchen table like a family Bible. He told them what the Corps said. He did not dramatize Thaddeus's voice. He let the sentence do its simple work. Don't build a wall where a table ought to be. They built a plan that walked on its own legs. Who had wood? Who had diesel? Whose pantry held more than pride? Which generator coughed but would run if asked nicely? Who remembered the radio tower out on Miller Ridge and how to coax it back into faith? They wrote names and jobs and notes. They drank coffee that tasted honest. They practiced a small, stubborn miracle. They trusted one another. The trucks rolled up the drive once, too late, and too many eyes behind glass. The men got out and made a show of authority. Mara met them with a smile that had paperwork folded inside it like a blade. Walter offered plates. It is difficult to enforce a seizure warrant on a casserole. They retreated, puzzled by a power that wasn't theirs to measure. "Tomorrow," Mara said when the door closed. "Tomorrow," Walter agreed, turning the ledger so the next line faced him like morning. By the time the last neighbor left, the snow had taken on that purposeful fall it gets when a storm decides to spend the night. The farmhouse glowed like the memory of a farmhouse. Walter stood at the sink and washed plates with a care that belonged to something other than dishes. He could feel the bunkers hum under the field the way a man can feel a train through rails with his palm. Distant, reliable, not demanding, just there. The ledger lay open on the table, its spine softened by steam and time, as if it had been waiting to relax. He called the names again the next morning, not because he doubted their answer, but because the work made him honest. A man who has learned to inventory failure can learn to inventory readiness. Wood, fuel, blankets, the phone tree that would not forget the shy or the proud. He drove to the church basement with a box of bulbs and left with 2 old radios and a promise of pies because pies are a currency no freezer knows how to counterfeit. He stopped by the clinic. The night nurse wrote down who needed generators when and who could stand to be visited whether they asked or not. In the field, he walked to the plate and stood over it with his hands in his coat like a man visiting a grave that isn't a grief anymore. "Thaddeus," he said, not loud. "We'll spend it right." He didn't know if he believed in talking to the dead. He believed in talking to the kept promise that bore a dead man's name. The difference was small and sufficient. Mara came and went. She was as at home on the porch with coffee as she had been in the circular room below. reading the quiet for changes. When she spoke of the network that had woken, other subsectors, other names, other cores, she did it with the humility of a mechanic pleased that a tool still worked. No triumph, just gratitude. Continuity, she said once, half to herself. Turns out the best technology is still a kitchen table. The men in the trucks returned a third time with a different tactic. Politeness, badges that weren't quite real, papers that looked official enough to confuse someone eager to be confused. They asked for signatures and explanations and to take the core topside for calibration. Walter listened to all of it and said, as if quoting a manual older than theirs, no. Mara provided a version of yes that meant no, in a language only bureaucrats speak. Neighbors gathered on the porch without being called. Casseroles make strange bodyguards. Nothing looks less like surrender than a hot dish in January. The trucks left with their dignity not entirely intact. Snow covered their tire tracks like a town choosing what not to remember. In the days that followed, nothing magical happened to Walter's debts. The roof still needed help. The tractor tire remained a slow confession of air, but the work had rearranged him. He was no longer a man carrying failure like wood. He was a man carrying names. That weighs less and more at once. On a late afternoon that finally remembered how to be blue, Walter walked the ridge where the elms stood like old men at ease. He looked out over a county that had been taught by pamphlets to hide and by kitchens to gather. He thought about the sentence Thaddeus had recorded in a year when people practiced fear for sport and called it wisdom. Don't mistake the plan for the people. He said it out loud and felt how saying it made a room in the air for someone else to stand. At the hedgerow he paused and listened the way he had before he owned anything here, ear-tuned to soil, to weather, to the aftersound of a message landed. The field didn't whisper this time. It rested. A different language. The earth had spent something and was content with the purchase. Walter Davis went home and set the table for supper. He lit the kitchen, then left the door unlatched, not because he expected company, but because the habit felt right. He folded the ledger open to the next page and sharpened a pencil. He didn't feel saved. He felt necessary. That's a kind of salvation a man can use. When he turned off the light, the house settled deeper on its foundation. In the lower field, under frost and the memory of corn, a machine older than his worst year kept a steady hum, like breath shared among friends. The land hadn't chosen an owner. It had chosen a name, and the name had answered.